In 2006, South Park aired an episode in which a cloud of toxic self-satisfaction generated by people driving hybrid cars threatened to merge with a smug storm above San Francisco and wipe the city off the map. The cloud was real. The people producing it were sniffing their own farts at dinner parties and calling it progressive politics. 4 years later, the show built its 200th episode around the idea that free speech must apply to everyone, and aired it anyway, over actual death threats from an extremist organization, only to have its own network bleep the entire moral of the story before it reached the audience. A show that spent 20 years insisting both sides were equally ridiculous eventually had to reckon with what happens when that position stops being sustainable. In 2025, with record-breaking ratings and a statement from the White House calling them irrelevant, the two men who created South Park looked at the political extremism they had spent 3 decades mocking from the middle and decided the middle was no longer a safe place to stand. Welcome to East Park. Let's get into it. The formula that started everything before South Park ever had a target. It had a shape. The show was only a few years old when its two creators sat down in front of a Reason magazine interviewer in Amsterdam and explained, with the precision of people who had been asked the question too many times, exactly what their program was built to do. Trey Parker described it as a formula that had been present from the very beginning, from the earliest short they had ever made, a Christmas short involving Jesus and Santa Claus fighting over who actually owned the holiday. On one side, there was a man representing organized religion. On the other side, there was a figure representing commercial excess. And in the middle, there were 4 children watching both of them lose their mind. And those children kept saying the same 2 words to both sides. Chill out. That was the engine. That was all it was, Parker explained. An extremist on this side and an extremist on that side, and 4 kids in the middle, pointing out that the 2 of them looked exactly alike. South Park premiered on Comedy Central on the 13th of August in 1997, and from its earliest episodes, it announced itself as a show with an unusual relationship to the political world around it. Other satirical programs of the era tended to lean visibly in one direction, shading toward one party or the other, pulling their hardest punches at whichever side they found least sympathetic. South Park refused to settle. Its creators were 2 young men from Colorado, Parker born in 1969, and Conifer and Stone in 1971 in Houston, who had met at the University of Colorado at Boulder in the early 90s and had spent the decade since then making each other laugh. What they shared, beyond an appetite for the outrageous, was a deep suspicion of anyone who told them what to think. Stone articulated it with unusual plainness in that same Reason interview. He had worn Birkenstocks in high school, he said, and had been the kind of person who was sure the people on the right side of the political spectrum were trying to control his life. Then he went to Boulder and immediately shed the Birkenstocks because everyone else had them, and he realized the people on the left were trying to control his life too. That, he said, was his entire political philosophy. Anyone who is telling you what you should do has to give you a very good reason first. That suspicion of the controlling impulse, wherever it originated, is the single most consistent thread in the show's entire political output. Across nearly 3 decades and more than 300 episodes, South Park has returned again and again to the same basic comic situation, which is a group of adults who have become so certain about something that they have tipped over from conviction into fanaticism, and a group of children who can see the fanaticism from across the room while the adults cannot see it at all. The show named its target not as the left or the right, but as the extremist, and it chased that target down every corridor of American life it could find, from environmental activism to religious fundamentalism to social media outrage to elected government itself. The extremist was always the joke. The moderate was always, at least in theory, the point. Understanding what the show was actually doing requires looking at what the 2 men who made it were actually saying. Over and over, in the years when the program was at its most politically coherent, Parker told that Reason audience in 2006 that Michael Moore being an extremist was just as bad as Donald Rumsfeld being an extremist. The show insisted they were, in some essential way, the same person. The left-wing filmmaker and the right-wing defense secretary occupied the same place in the show's moral universe because they shared the same defining characteristic, which was the absolute certainty that they alone possessed the truth, and that anyone who disagreed was not merely wrong but morally deficient. It takes a 4th-grade kid, Parker said, to look at both of them and say that they remind him of each other. That 4th-grade kid, in every case, was some combination of Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny, the show's 4 central characters, who had been positioned from the very first episode as the closest thing to a voice of reason the program could offer. This positioning was not accidental. The children of South Park are not wise exactly, and the show has never pretended they are. They swear, they scheme, they hold prejudices and make messes, and occasionally commit acts of genuine moral horror. Cartman apartment alone is a walking refutation of the idea that children are naturally good. But the children observe. They are present for everything the adults do, watching the grown-ups of their town lose their minds over one issue after another. And because they are children and not adults, they have not yet acquired the ideological commitments that would make the madness invisible to them. They see it plainly, in the way that only an outsider to a system can ever see it plainly. The show made this the center of its political satirical method, placing characters with no settled politics in the middle of every controversy and letting the controversy reveal itself through their reactions to it. The trouble with this formula, and the trouble that would eventually force the show to reckon with its own premises, was that it depended on a specific idea about how extremism worked. The idea was symmetry. The show assumed and announced and performed the assumption for decades that the far left and the far right were mirror images, that the fanatic on one side and the fanatic on the other were producing the same kind of harm and deserved the same kind of mockery. This is why the formula worked so cleanly for so many years. An episode that attacked environmental extremists could be followed by an episode attacking religious fundamentalists, and neither felt out of character, because the target was always the extremism itself, never the underlying position. The show could and did make fun of climate change denial in one year and performative environmentalism in another, and both fit the same template. The template was the only politics the show claimed to have. The cultural conversation around South Park during its most politically active years in the early and middle 2000s became a genuinely strange spectacle, because both sides of the political divide kept trying to claim the program as their own. In 2001, a writer named Andrew Sullivan coined the phrase South Park Republican to describe a type of young, culturally libertarian conservative who shared the show's contempt for political correctness and its willingness to mock liberal pieties. The phrase caught on immediately because it described something real about a strain of American political feeling that had not previously had a name. Sullivan described these South Park Republicans as people who believed in a hard foreign policy and were deeply skeptical of the kind of moral instruction that came packaged as cultural sensitivity. They watched the show and felt seen, in the same way that anyone who has been told they are not allowed to laugh at something recognizes a kindred spirit in a show that laughs at everything. In 2005, a writer named Brian Anderson published an entire book expanding Sullivan's concept, calling it South Park Conservatives, treating the program as evidence of a revolt against liberal media bias that was transforming American culture. The book reached Parker and Stone, and their reaction was characteristic. Parker told Time magazine in 2006 that the book was a fair description in some respects, and then immediately added that the author could just as easily have written a book called South Park Liberals, because they had attacked a great deal of what conservative people and institutions do in America. This response was not false modesty. It was the clearest possible statement of the show's actual position, which was that it belonged to neither faction and wanted very much for both factions to understand that. The problem was that the two factions kept refusing to understand it. Both sides saw what they wanted to see in the show, filtered it through their own ideological commitments, and came away convinced it was secretly on their team. Matt Stone addressed this problem with characteristic bluntness in a statement he made in 2005 that became one of the most quoted sentences ever attached to the show. He said that he hated conservative, and then added that he really hated liberal. The sentence was almost instantly shorn of its first half, and circulated as proof that the show leaned right, as evidence that Stone and Parker were finally admitting what the conservative commentators had been saying all along. The selective quotation was itself a perfect demonstration of the thing the show kept satirizing, which is the tendency of people with strong ideological commitments to hear only the part of any statement that confirms what they already believe. Stone hated both equally. That was the point. It was practically the entire point of the show, compressed into a single sentence with a conjunction in the middle. The formula had a structural requirement that most people who praised or attacked the show never fully acknowledged, which is that it needed the extremists on both sides to be more or less equally ridiculous in order to function. If one side's fanaticism was genuinely more dangerous or more consequential than the others, the symmetry broke down, and the show's position in the middle stopped being satire and started being something closer to false equivalence. For most of the show's early years, the formula held because the show was operating in a period when the loudest voices on both sides were producing roughly comparable varieties of cultural nonsense, when evangelical pressure groups on the right and performative activist culture on the left were both generating ample material for a program committed to mocking the extremes. The middle felt like a defensible place to stand because the extremes were occupying recognizably similar territory. The most useful way to understand what the show was doing with political extremism in those first 2 decades is to listen carefully to how Parker described the 4 children's function in the machine. They were not there to deliver answers, he said. said, they were not spokesmen for any position. They were there to look at both extremists and notice the resemblance between them. This is what the show called reason, and what it used children to embody, precisely because children were the only characters available who had not yet been issued the ideology that would make the resemblance invisible. Kyle delivers what the show sometimes calls its moral of the episode, those closing moments where he turns to the camera and explains what he has learned. And the point is not that Kyle is right about everything. The point is that Kyle is still capable of being surprised by the world, still capable of registering absurdity, still standing outside the walls of the belief system rather than inside them. The extremist is always the person who stopped being surprised. It is worth pausing on the genuine philosophical position that underlies all of this, because it is more coherent than the show's critics from either direction have generally given it credit for. The show was not saying that no political positions were better than others. It was not arguing that everything was equally valid or that the search for truth was pointless. What it was arguing, in the voice of the Reason interview and the Formula and the Douche and Turd episode and the Smug Alert and 100 other installments, was that certainty itself was the problem. That the moment a person's commitment to a position became so total that they could no longer hear any contrary evidence or find any humor in themselves, they had stopped being a participant in a community and had become a danger to it. The children could see this. The adults in their town could not. The children remained capable of asking whether things had gone too far. The adults had lost the ability to ask that question because the asking of it would threaten the identity they had built around the answer. This is the animating idea that Parker and Stone carried into every political episode they ever made, and it is the idea that makes the show's history with political extremism worth tracing carefully, because the idea was eventually tested by something the show did not anticipate when it designed its formula. The test was not any single episode or any single controversy. It was the slow accumulation of evidence that the extremism the show was mocking was not always symmetrically dangerous, that the fanatics on both sides were not always producing equivalent harm, and that a program committed to standing in the middle had to eventually reckon with what happens when the middle stops being equidistant from the two edges. The show's relationship to that reckoning, stretched across years and seasons and a pair of presidential elections and an eventual reversal of one of its own most famous positions, is one of the most interesting stories in the history of American political satire, and it begins with the clearest statement the show ever made about how it intended to operate. Parker, speaking to that Amsterdam audience in 2006, said that the show believed there was a middle ground and that most people actually lived there, and that the extremists only seemed to dominate because they were the loudest and the most entertaining. He said that the extremist on the left was not evil, and the extremist on the right was not evil. He said there was something to be worked out. The formula assumed the middle would hold. For a long time it did. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. South Park announced its political formula early and held it tightly. 2 extremists and 4 children watching them from the middle. Next, the show deploys that formula for the first time at full scale, aiming it at American electoral politics, and arrives at a conclusion so simple it became the defining political statement of the program's entire run. Section 2. The Douche, the Turd, and the Election Machine. Every few years, something happens to American politics that makes the country feel like it has arrived somewhere new, somewhere the old maps do not cover. A candidate emerges who seems genuinely different, or a race becomes so emotionally charged that people on one side or the other begin to talk about it as though the fate of civilization depends on the outcome. The intensity of these moments is real. The belief that this time is different, that this particular election carries a weight that previous ones did not, is one of the most durable features of democratic life in the United States. South Park looked at all of this and built its response out of 4 words and a mascot. The response became one of the most quoted pieces of political commentary the show ever produced, a statement so compact and so bleak that it has attached itself permanently to the way a large portion of the American audience thinks about elections. The 4 words were giant douche and turd sandwich, and the statement was that the choice between them is not incidental to democracy. It is democracy. The episode was called Douche and Turd, and it aired on Comedy Central on the 27th of October in 2004, 1 week before the presidential election between George W. Bush and John Kerry. It was the 8th episode of season 8, the 119th episode of the series overall. The immediate context was an election that had generated an unusual level of emotional investment, a race that had drawn in celebrities as political spokespeople and produced an atmosphere in which not voting was treated as a moral failure, roughly equivalent to collaboration with the enemy. The deeper context was the show's formula, the one described in the last section, and the question of what that formula looked like when applied not to a fringe belief or a cultural trend, but to the central mechanism of American civic life itself. The episode begins at a school pep rally, where a group of protesters from a local chapter of an animal rights organization objects to the use of a cow as South Park Elementary's mascot. The protest is immediately effective. The school agrees to hold a student election for a new mascot. What happens next follows the show's political logic with perfect internal consistency. The students are presented with two replacement options, both of which are hopelessly bland and unappealing. Kyle, frustrated by the blandness, suggests as a joke that the choices be elevated to something more honest. His joke candidate is a giant douche. Cartman counters with a turd sandwich, and through the ordinary machinery of student politics, the two joke candidates become the real candidates, the actual figures on the ballot, and the election is scheduled to decide between them. The parallel to national politics does not require any interpretation. The episode is a direct and deliberate map of the two-party system, with the giant douche and the turd sandwich standing in for every presidential election the audience had witnessed. But the show is careful about where it places its satirical weight. The primary target is not the candidates themselves, which in this case are cartoons of excrement. The primary target is the emotional apparatus that surrounds the election, the way in which the intensity of the democratic process gets attached to choices that do not meaningfully differ in quality. Both options are bad. Both have been selected because they are the kind of thing that rises to the top of a system designed to elevate whatever is most willing to campaign hard. And yet everyone in South Park has been told, and most of them have come to believe, that the choice between them is the most important choice they will ever make. Stan Marsh is the episode's moral center, and his function in the story is to refuse. He looks at the two candidates and he says, with the plainness of a child who has not yet been taught to pretend otherwise, that he does not want to vote for either of them. This is treated by everyone around him as a catastrophic and possibly deranged position. His parents are appalled. His teachers intervene. The entire community mobilizes against his abstention in a way that the episode stages as gently absurd, because the mobilization is more intense and more serious than any of the attention paid to the actual candidates or the actual choice. Stan is told, repeatedly and by different adults, that he must vote because people died for his right to vote. The argument is not about which candidate is better. The argument is that the act of choosing between the two, whatever the two happen to be, is so sacred that abstaining from it is a betrayal of the dead. The episode takes this argument seriously enough to let it develop before it undermines it. Stan runs away from the election, fleeing into the wilderness, and is eventually captured by the animal rights protesters, whose original complaint started the whole chain of events. The organization, as presented in the episode, is not a moderate group concerned with animal welfare. It is a fanatical movement prepared to use violence to enforce its positions, and it holds Stan at gunpoint and demands that he return to South Park and vote, because only by voting can he prevent the worst candidate from winning. The logic of the threat is, of course, the logic of every election season in miniature. Vote for the lesser of the two evils, or the greater evil will prevail, and that will be your fault. The episode stages this argument as a hostage situation, which is the show's way of making visible the coercive subtext of an argument that is usually delivered with more civility. What saves Stan is the animal rights protesters themselves, who are eventually destroyed in a confrontation with P. Diddy, the rapper who has become the face of a celebrity get out the vote campaign running through the episode. Diddy has been chasing Stan across the country with a crew and a camera, threatening to kill anyone who does not vote, which is the episode's exaggeration of the celebrity endorsement culture that surrounded that particular election. The producers of that culture told people their vote was not just a civic duty but a matter of life and death, and the show transformed that rhetoric into its literal form, which is a famous man threatening murder. When P. Diddy collides with the animal rights faction, both groups annihilate each other, and Stan is freed to return to South Park and make his own choice. The lesson Stan receives, and the lesson the episode lands on, is delivered by the animal rights leader before everything falls apart. He tells Stan that the choice between a giant douche and a turd sandwich is not an aberration. It is not a failure of a particular election cycle or a sign that things have gone wrong. It is the permanent condition of democratic politics, because a douche and a turd sandwich are the only things that suck up enough, over enough time, through enough ambition, and enough willingness to absorb punishment and compromise and humiliation to actually reach the position of being on the ballot. The process selects for a particular type. The type is not one that a person of ordinary dignity would choose to become, and so the ballot will always, in this telling, present the voter with two varieties of the same essential deficiency. Stan returns. He votes for the turd sandwich on the grounds that it is marginally preferable to the giant douche. His vote does not change the outcome. The giant douche wins by a margin so large that Stan's single vote made no perceptible difference. He is initially disheartened by this, and his parents try to console him with the argument that every vote matters even when it loses. The episode ends on that note, holding two things at once, which is that the outcome was determined without him, and that participating anyway was the correct correct choice. The show is not, in the end, arguing for abstention. It is arguing for a clear-eyed engagement, for voting without illusion, for choosing between insufficient options because the alternative is to let the process proceed without you, which changes nothing about the options. What the episode understood, and what gave it its unusual durability as a piece of political commentary, is the way it separated two things that American political culture usually insists on combining. It separated the act of voting from the belief that voting is transformative. The show argued for the act while demolishing the belief. You should vote, the episode says, not because your candidate will save you or because this particular choice will change history, but because the process is the only mechanism available and opting out of it does not improve the option. The act is worth doing, even under the clear and accurate understanding that the options are insufficient. This is not the triumphant civics lesson that celebrities and campaigns were delivering in 2004. It is something sadder and more honest, a defense of democratic participation that begins by stripping away every inspiring story about what democratic participation means. The animal rights protesters are the episode's sharpest piece of structural satire, and they reward close attention. They are the extremists in the formula, the fanatical element that the show positions outside the reasonable center, but they are not extremists in the usual way the show deploys that character type. They are not wrong about their core concern, which is that animals deserve moral consideration. What makes them the episode's villain is not their position, but their method and their certainty, the willingness to use violence to enforce their view of how other people should engage with civic processes they do not control. The animal rights protesters would kill Stan rather than let him abstain. This is the extremist's relationship to freedom, which is that other people's freedom to disagree is acceptable up to the point where it threatens the extremist's preferred outcome, at which point the freedom must be overridden. The episode does not dismiss the substance of animal welfare as a concern. It dismisses the certainty that authorizes the gun. P. Diddy's Vote or Die campaign is a softer target, and the show handles it with a proportionately lighter touch. The celebrity who turns civic engagement into a performance of his own moral seriousness is a reliable figure in American political life, the person who attaches themselves to an election as a vehicle for their own importance. The episode does not suggest that getting people to vote is bad. It suggests that the performance of outrage over non-voters, the social pressure campaign that treats abstention as a character flaw, is a substitute for engaging seriously with why people might not feel represented by the available choices. Stan's refusal to vote is not apathy, it is a considered rejection, and the episode treats it as a considered rejection while also eventually concluding that the considered rejection should resolve itself back into participation. The show is more sophisticated than either its detractors on the left, who saw the episode as an endorsement of cynicism, or its admirers on the right, who saw it as an attack on democratic voter mobilization, could comfortably accommodate. The episode was cited so frequently in the years after it aired that the terms giant douche and turd sandwich became a genuine part of American political vernacular, shorthand for the frustration of the moderate voter who finds neither major candidate inspiring. It became one of those cultural artifacts that people who have never seen it know about, referenced in op-ed pieces and casual conversation as a summary of a feeling that political commentary is usually too invested in the system to express. The show had named something that large numbers of people recognized, and the naming was itself satisfying in the way that any honest articulation of a widely shared but rarely spoken feeling tends to be satisfying. What the episode also did, though this was less remarked upon at the time, was establish the terms on which South Park would approach every subsequent election it covered. The 2008 presidential election produced an episode called About Last Night, which aired the night after the results came in and depicted both Obama supporters and McCain supporters as having completely lost their minds, the former celebrating with a drunken recklessness that treated a change of administration as a license for chaos, the latter descending into apocalyptic terror and building bunkers against the coming catastrophe. The episode revealed that Obama and McCain were secretly an elite team of jewel thieves who had run for president as cover for a plan to steal the Hope Diamond from the Smithsonian. When the heist was complete, Obama decided to stay and govern anyway. The show was making the same argument it had always made, which is that the emotional investment of either side, the ecstasy of victory or the horror of defeat, was wildly disproportionate to the reality of what an election actually changes in the lives of ordinary people. Neither the salvation the Democrats were celebrating nor the catastrophe the Republicans were mourning would materialize, because the country is larger and more stable than the story either side had been telling about the election. The 2016 season extended the douche and turd framework into a full 10-episode arc, with the Republican candidate, represented by Mr. Garrison, and the Democratic candidate, identified by her conventional description. The show returned explicitly to its earlier language, with a character noting that the country was once again choosing between a giant douche and a turd sandwich, and Stan expressing weary recognition of the familiar trap. What the season struggled with, and what it was honest enough to acknowledge in real time, was that the formula was beginning to feel strained by the specific nature of the choice being presented. The show had built its electoral satire on the premise that both candidates were equally insufficient, that the douche and the turd were both bad in the same way and to the same degree, and the 2016 race put pressure on that premise in ways the show found difficult to resolve cleanly. The season ended without the resolution the writers had planned, because the result was not the one they had expected, and they admitted as much publicly afterward. But the foundational statement of the show's relationship to electoral politics remained the 2004 episode, because it was the cleanest and most direct expression of the idea. The election machine always produces the same choice. The choice is always between two people who are, in the formula's terms, versions of the same fundamental disappointment. You should still vote, because the machine runs whether you participate or not, and participation at least gives you standing in the outcome. But you should vote without confusing the act with something it is not, without telling yourself that the person you are voting for is a solution rather than an option, without letting the machinery of the election persuade you that the intensity it has generated is proportionate to the actual stakes of the decision you are making. The giant douche and the turd sandwich are not special. They are the product of a system, and the system produces what it produces, and the honest response to that is to hold your nose and pull the lever and know exactly what you are doing and why, and not to pretend it is something more. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The douche and the turd established the show's framework for election, both sides equally unworthy, and the whole system worth participating in anyway. Next, that same both sides formula gets aimed at a different kind of extremism, not the cruelty of power, but the self-satisfaction of the virtuous, and the show produces its most savage portrait of a person who believes their good intentions excuse everything. Section 3. The smug cloud and the smell of virtue. There is a particular kind of person who is very difficult to argue with, not because their arguments are good, but because their certainty makes argument feel beside the point. This is the person who has adopted a correct position and then arranged their entire sense of self around having adopted it, so that any challenge to the position feels to them like an attack on their character. The position itself becomes secondary to the performance of holding it. The caring is the point. The demonstrating of the caring is the point, and anyone who questions either the caring or the demonstration is immediately identified as someone who does not care, which is the worst thing a person can be in the vocabulary of that particular worldview. South Park spent years thinking about this person, and in the spring of 2006, it made an episode about them that was so precise and so merciless that it has outlasted almost every other piece of satire produced about that cultural type. Not because the type has disappeared, but because it keeps returning in slightly different costumes, and the episode keeps fitting whoever is wearing the current costume with unnerving accuracy. The episode was called Smug Alert, and it was the second installment of season 10, the 141st episode of the show overall. It aired on Comedy Central on the 29th of March in 2006. The writer and director was Trey Parker, as was almost always the case, and the premise was simple enough to summarize in a sentence. Gerald Broflovsky, Kyle's father, buys a Toyota Prius, the hybrid car that had become, in the mid-2000s, the dominant status symbol of a certain kind of environmentally conscious American consumer. The Prius was genuinely better for the environment than a conventional gasoline vehicle. That was not in dispute. What the episode was interested in was not the car itself, but what happened to Gerald after he bought it, which is that he became insufferable. The show had been building toward a portrait of this figure for years. Gerald is an educated, well-intentioned, fundamentally decent man, a lawyer with good instincts and a genuine concern for the world around him. He is not, in most episodes, a villain. He is simply someone who, upon acquiring the Prius, discovers that the acquisition has given him a new relationship to the people around him, a relationship of implicit superiority. He does not drive past a car at a gas station without a sense of moral elevation. He does not engage in a conversation about the environment without the consciousness that he has done more than the person he is speaking to. The car has become the outward sign of an inward state, and the inward state is the conviction that Gerald Broflovsky has figured something out that most people have not, and that this figuring out entitles him to a certain amount of condescension toward those who have not yet caught up. The episode makes this concrete in its opening scenes by having Gerald drive slowly and deliberately past other cars on the road, rolling down his window to deliver unsolicited judgments about their vehicles, issuing what the show describes as tickets for environmental violation, scraps of paper that carry no legal weight but function as the physical form of Gerald's moral superiority. He is not helping anyone. He is performing. The performance is directed not at the environment, which is not present to be impressed, but at the people around him, who are and who can register the judgment he is making making about their choices. The Prius is, in this reading, less a tool for reducing emissions than a tool for announcing who Gerald is and what Gerald has decided about the other people in his town. What follows from Gerald's behavior is the chain reaction that the episode is structured around. Uncomfortable with the social friction that Gerald's condescension has created, Kyle's mother Sheila does not push back against Gerald directly. Instead, she simply cannot live with the situation as it stands, and eventually the family makes a decision. Gerald announces that he cannot stay in South Park, a community that does not share his values regarding the environment, and that the family will be moving to San Francisco, a city where the people have already figured out what Gerald has figured out and where he will not have to endure the presence of those who have not. The family departs. Kyle loses his best friend, and San Francisco, as the episode portrays it, is waiting for Gerald with open arms. The show's portrait of San Francisco in this episode is the broadest and most deliberately provocative element of the whole piece, and it is worth sitting with what the show was actually doing with it, because the portrait is easy to misread as simple mockery of a geographic location. San Francisco in the episode is not presented as a bad place, because its residents hold progressive views. The show had no interest in attacking the underlying positions that San Francisco residents held in 2006 about the environment or about any other political question. What it was interested in was a specific behavioral pattern that it associated with a specific social milieu, the pattern of people who had organized their social world around the shared performance of their own enlightenment, who communicated primarily through mutual affirmation of how much more evolved they were than the people who did not live as they lived, and who had, in the show's image, begun to actually smell their own emissions and find them pleasant. That image, the citizens of San Francisco literally bending over at dinner parties to inhale their own flatulence and sighing with pleasure, is the episode's central comic device, and it is also its central argument. The smug cloud is real in the episode's world. It is a measurable atmospheric phenomenon, detected by environmental rangers who monitor its levels the way they monitor smog levels, and it is generated not by the hybrid cars themselves, whose actual emissions are low, but by the sense of moral elevation that the people driving those cars have accumulated. The smug is the byproduct of self-satisfaction, and it billows upward from San Francisco in dangerous quantity, threatening to combine with other smug disturbances and produce a storm capable of destroying the region entirely. The comic device is absurdist, but the underlying argument is not. The episode is saying that a person can be right about an issue and simultaneously make the world worse by the manner in which they are right about it, that there is a way of holding a correct position that produces toxicity rather than benefit, and that the toxicity comes specifically from the self-congratulation, from the replacement of genuine concern with the performance of genuine concern. The smug storm that builds over the course of the episode combines three sources. The first is the smug generated by San Francisco's existing population. The second is the smug generated by South Park itself, where Stan has successfully campaigned for the entire town to switch to hybrid vehicles, and the town has done so and is now generating its own smug at a rate that has made it the second most polluted city in the nation. And the third is a smug disturbance generated by a single individual, a real person, George Clooney, whose acceptance speech at that year's Academy Awards had produced what the episode's environmental scientist describes as a toxic cloud of self-satisfaction capable of contributing meaningfully to the coming catastrophe. The Clooney detail is precise and unsparing. The speech in question, which Clooney had given at the 78th Academy Awards in March of 2006, weeks before the episode aired, had expressed pride in Hollywood for being ahead of the cultural curve on social issues. The show identified this kind of speech as a contribution to the problem it was documenting, a public figure using a moment of visibility not to advance a cause, but to congratulate an industry for having already advanced it. What saves Kyle from the storm, and what allows the episode to resolve, is Cartman. The detail of Cartman performing the rescue is one of the show's cleverest structural choices, because Cartman is the least sympathetic character available for the task, and the show is transparent about why he is doing it. Cartman does not want to save Kyle out of friendship or love. He wants Kyle back because Kyle is his favorite target for insults, and Butters, who has been substituting in Kyle's absence, is too easy and too willing and makes the whole enterprise unsatisfying. Cartman needs someone who will fight back, someone whose intelligence and moral seriousness make the combat worthwhile. The rescue is entirely selfish. It is also the rescue. The show is doing something specific with this choice. By making Cartman the person who actually acts while the ideologically correct people are busy congratulating each other, it undercuts the moral order that the smug culture assumes. The self-proclaimed environmentally conscious father is trapped in a city, drowning in its own self-admiration. The racist sociopathic child is the one who drives to San Francisco in a car that runs on gasoline, braving the smug cloud and physically extracts Kyle from the catastrophe. The episode does not suggest that Cartman is better than Gerald. It suggests that in a particular moment, the person who acts, even for bad reasons, accomplishes more than the person who performs virtue, even for good reasons. This is a harder point than the fart jokes make it appear. The episode's resolution involves the smug cloud being so severe that it appears on the verge of destroying San Francisco entirely. The city is saved not by the self-congratulation of its residents, but by the natural dispersal of atmospheric conditions. And in the aftermath, the Broflovskis return to South Park. Gerald is briefly humbled by the experience. Kyle is reunited with his friends. Stan, who had successfully converted the town to hybrid vehicles in Gerald's absence, watches the ranger who had praised his efforts now turn against them as the source of the smug crisis. The town switches away from hybrids. The environment is not meaningfully improved by any of the episode's events. The status quo is restored, and the show does not particularly lament this outcome. What Smug Alert was responding to was something quite specific in the American cultural atmosphere of 2006, a moment when environmental consciousness had become a significant marker of class and cultural identity in a way that it had not been in earlier decades. The hybrid car, specifically the Toyota Prius, had been designed and was being marketed in a way that made it visually identifiable as a hybrid, distinguishable from conventional vehicles, which meant that driving one was a statement as much as a choice. The car announced its own virtue. It was one of the first consumer products to be designed with its social signaling function as a primary feature rather than an incidental one. People who bought it knew they were buying a statement, and the market reflected this, with the Prius commanding a premium that could not be fully explained by its fuel savings alone. Part of what buyers were paying for was the visibility of the virtue. The episode understood this dynamic clearly, and it was careful not to attack the underlying concern about the environment that the hybrid culture was expressing. Smog levels do go down when people drive hybrids. The ranger who confronts Stan early in the episode acknowledges this directly. The problem is not the car. The problem is what happens to the people inside the car, who have discovered that the car gives them a social identity that they find very difficult to separate from the environmental purpose the car is supposed to serve. The identity becomes the primary thing. The smug is the secondary emission, more dangerous than the carbon dioxide the car was purchased to reduce. The academic literature on this episode has treated it as a critique of what scholars call environmental puritanism, the tendency of environmental advocacy to shade into a moralistic framework that prioritizes the display of virtue over the production of actual environmental outcomes. The research published on this point has noted that the episode is targeting the messenger more than the message, that Gerald is being mocked not for caring about the environment, but for the condescending way in which he communicates that caring to people who have not yet arrived at his conclusions. The show's position, to the extent it has one on this subject, is that a person can be right and insufferable at the same time, and that the insufferability can do real damage to the cause the person is nominally serving, because it drives people away from the underlying position by associating it with the social identity of the people who hold it most loudly. This argument runs all the way through the show's treatment of left-wing extremism across dozens of episodes, and it is worth naming precisely because it is often misread. The show is frequently described as anti-environmentalist or anti-progressive based on episodes like Smug Alert, and that description misses the target. The show is pro-environment and largely supportive of the underlying values that progressive politics claims as its foundation. What the show cannot stand, and what it returns to again and again, is the performance of those values as a substitute for the enactment of them. The person who has made caring about a thing into their primary identity rather than their primary motivation. That person is, in the show's taxonomy, an extremist. Their extremism is not in their position, it is in their relationship to their position, the totality of their investment in it. The way the position has become so central to who they are that they can no longer separate the virtue of the cause from the social rewards of being seen to champion it. Gerald Broflovsky is the show's most complete portrait of this type, and the show is not done with him after Smug Alert. He returns across the seasons as a figure whose progressive instincts keep shading into something uglier, whose concern for the world keeps finding expression in ways that are really about Gerald rather than about the world. He is the face of the kind-hearted, well-meaning, self-regarding liberal whom the show can never quite stop poking. Not because liberals are worse than the conservatives the show also mocks, but because, as Matt Stone said, it is more fun to rip on liberals when nobody else does it. That joke, and the Smug Alert episode that is its fullest expression, contains within it the contradiction that would eventually challenge the show's entire political philosophy. If the smug cloud is the real danger, if the self-congratulatory liberal is the thing most worth satirizing, then at what point does that satirical priority become its own kind of distortion, its own variety of the asymmetry the show always claim to be correcting? That question does not have a clean answer in 2006. The smug cloud threatens San Francisco and South Park equally. Cartman saves the day by accident. Gerald comes home. Things go back to normal. The formula holds. But the question is planted inside the episode for anyone willing to sit with it. The question of whether a satire that finds liberals more fun to mock than conservatives is really the perfectly balanced thing it claims to be, or whether the fun itself is a signal about something the creators might not have been fully aware of. For now, the formula holds. For now, the cloud disperses and the city is saved, and Gerald is briefly chastened, and the Prius drivers of South Park return to their conventional vehicles. The smug retreats for a while. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Smug Alert targeted the progressive who performs virtue rather than practices it, and for years, the formula held it in perfect balance with the show's attacks on the right. Next, that balance is tested by an episode that aimed directly at the most powerful extremist institution in America and found that some organizations fight back in ways that change what a television show can say about them. Section 4. Trapped in the Closet and the Limits of the Untouchable. There is a useful way to understand what South Park was doing in its middle seasons, a way that cuts through the debates about whether the show leaned left or right or neither. The show was not primarily interested in political position. It was interested in power, specifically in the power that accrues to any organization or belief system that has successfully made itself exempt from criticism, that has surrounded itself with enough legal threat or social pressure or genuine danger to persuade the media and the culture around it to look away. Parker and Stone have described this impulse in several interviews across the years. The magnetic pull they feel toward whatever the current taboo happens to be, the thing that no one else is willing to touch. Matt Stone told a journalist that he and Parker are attracted to the taboo the way flies are attracted to honey. Wherever the thing no one will say is located, that is where they want to be. This instinct led the show, in the fall of 2005, to an organization that had spent decades making itself one of the most effectively untouchable institutions in American public life. The Church of Scientology had developed a reputation, carefully earned through aggressive litigation, and what critics described as a systematic approach to discrediting and harassing its opponents, for being the kind of organization that people in entertainment and media were very careful not to provoke. The show business world had enough high-profile members of the church that crossing it carried professional risk. Lawyers were expensive and proceedings were unpleasant, and the whole thing had a way of consuming time and money that most satirists found easier to avoid. The network Showtime had reportedly refused to allow an episode of Penn Jillette's documentary series to focus on Scientology as a subject. The show South Park had itself avoided the topic for nearly a decade out of loyalty to Isaac Hayes, the musician who voiced the character Chef and who was a practicing Scientologist. Parker and Stone had known about Hayes' faith and had stayed away from his church as a courtesy. By 2005, after 9 seasons, they could no longer resist. The episode was called Trapped in the Closet, and it aired on Comedy Central on the 16th of November in 2005. It was the 12th episode of season 9, the 152nd episode of the show overall. Parker wrote and directed it. The premise placed Stan Marsh inside the Church of Scientology's recruitment process, which the episode depicted through a version of the auditing procedure, a core practice of the church involving a device called an e-meter that is used to measure the subject's mental and emotional state. Stan's readings come back extraordinary. The church officials who administer the test conclude, with mounting excitement, that Stan's numbers match those of only one other person in recorded history, which is L. Ron Hubbard, the science fiction writer who founded Scientology. They declare Stan the reincarnation of their founder. Word spreads. Tom Cruise arrives at the Marsh house because Tom Cruise is one of the most famous Scientologists in the world, and this moment is significant to him. Cruise goes to Stan's room to meet the boy. Stan, with the directness of a child who has not learned to manage adult feelings, tells Cruise that he is a good actor, but not the greatest actor he has ever seen. Cruise, devastated, retreats to Stan's closet and will not come out. The joke runs for most of the episode's second half, with a series of famous people arriving at the house to try to talk Tom Cruise out of the closet, including John Travolta and R. Kelly, both of whom end up in the closet with him. The double meaning in the phrase "come out of the closet" is present throughout, and the show makes no effort to conceal it. The episode is doing two things simultaneously with the same joke. On one level, it is a parody of a specific celebrity culture around the church, the way in which high-profile members reinforce each other's investment in the organization and create a social world in which the church is simply assumed to be true. On another level, it is a very old joke about the gap between public persona and private reality, rendered in the crudest possible form by having the characters physically inside a closet while other characters beg them to emerge. But the episode's most significant sequence is not the closet material. It is a passage in which the show depicts, on screen, in plain language, the core cosmological beliefs of Scientology. A text card appears on screen reading, "This is what Scientologists actually believe," and the episode then describes the story of Xenu, an intergalactic dictator who, according to Scientology doctrine, as documented by critics of the church and former members, populated Earth billions of years ago by bringing alien beings here, killing them, and implanting their spiritual residue in humans. The show presents this not as mockery, but as reportage, stating it plainly and accurately, according to available accounts from former church members and documents that had been published in legal proceedings and in journalism. The "This is what Scientologists actually believe" text was the show announcing that it was not inventing the absurdity, it was transcribing it. The episode was praised widely on broadcast and received an Emmy nomination for Outstanding Animated Program the following year. Comedy Central reran it, and then something changed. In March of 2006, a statement was issued in Isaac Hayes' name that he was leaving South Park, citing the show's willingness to mock religious groups as the reason. Hayes had been the voice of Chef since the first season. He was beloved by the audience and by the creators. His departure was a genuine loss and a genuine piece of news. Parker and Stone responded publicly, noting with pointed restraint that Hayes had never previously objected to the show's treatment of any religious organization, that he had voiced Chef through episodes mocking Mormons and Catholics and evangelical Christians and every other faith the show had touched, and that his objection had arrived specifically after the episode about Scientology. What Parker and Stone believed, and said carefully, was that Hayes had been pressured into the statement rather than having issued it freely. The evidence that emerged over subsequent years supported this reading. Hayes' son, Isaac Hayes III, stated years later that his father had suffered a stroke in January of 2006, shortly after Trapped in the Closet aired, and that the stroke had left him unable to make decisions or speak for himself. The statement that appeared in Hayes' name in March was, according to his son, not Hayes' own decision. Scientology, the son wrote in a public statement, had done this, not his father. Whatever the full truth of the situation, Hayes died in 2008, and the question of whether he had willingly abandoned a role he had performed for a decade remained unresolved in the way that questions about incapacitated people's stated intentions tend to remain unresolved. The show's response to Hayes' departure was characteristic. The season 10 premiere, which aired in March of 2006, killed Chef. The episode was called The Return of Chef, and it was constructed almost entirely from archival audio of Hayes' recordings over the years, spliced together to create new lines of dialogue that the show needed to service the plot. Chef is depicted as having been corrupted by a predatory organization called the Super Adventure Club, brainwashed into inappropriate behavior toward children, and he dies in an extended and deliberately extravagant sequence involving a waterfall, wild animals, and impalement. The show made absolutely no secret of what it was doing. Chef's corruption by the Super Adventure Club was a direct parallel of Hayes' association with Scientology as the show understood it, and the episode made that parallel as explicit as it could without naming the church directly. The credits rolled over an image of Chef in a South Park-style heaven, and the boys delivered a brief farewell. Then the episode ended, and Chef was gone from the series permanently. The closet material involving Tom Cruise produced its own controversy in the period surrounding Hayes' departure. In March of 2006, Comedy Central was scheduled to rerun Trapped in the Closet, and the rerun was pulled. The official explanation from the network was programming related, but the timing was such that the incident attracted immediate attention and speculation. Parker and Stone responded with a statement so pointed and so laced with deliberate comedy that it has been quoted many times since. They addressed Scientology directly, referring to themselves as servants of the Dark Lord Xenu, a reference to the episode's own depiction of Scientology's cosmology, and announced that temporarily pulling their episode would not stop them from keeping Thetans forever trapped in the human bodies the organization had created for them. The statement was funny, but it was also a very clear announcement that the show intended to continue. It would not be intimidated out of its subject matter. Tom Cruise himself was never officially connected to the decision to pull the rerun. His representatives denied any involvement. The episode has since become available on streaming and has been widely circulated, making the attempted suppression one of the more counterproductive exercises in celebrity damage control of that period. The Emmy nomination the episode received elevated its profile further, ensuring that the attempt to make it disappear had precisely the opposite effect from what anyone hoping to suppress it might have wanted. By the spring of 2006, Trapped in the Closet was probably the most talked about episode in the show's history, and Scientology was receiving a quality and quantity of public scrutiny it had not previously endured from mainstream entertainment media. The episode did several things simultaneously that are worth separating. First, it demonstrated that the show was genuinely prepared to go places other programs would not go, that the attraction to the taboo taboo was real and not performative. Showtime had declined. Comedy Central initially allowed it, then briefly retreated, then held its ground. The show and its creators maintained their position throughout, and the position was that no organization was sufficiently powerful or sufficiently litigious or sufficiently socially protected to be exempt from the treatment the show gave every other institution it encountered. Second, the episode demonstrated that there were real-world consequences to this position, that the taboo was taboo for actual reasons rather than mere timidity, that going there would cost something. The cost in this case was Isaac Hayes, which was a genuine cost that the creators acknowledged and mourned even as they refused to reverse their creative decision. Third, and most relevant to the show's long argument about political extremism, the episode produced a working definition of what made Scientology the particular kind of target it was. The show was not attacking Scientology because it was a religion. It had attacked plenty of religions. It had an entire episode dedicated to Mormonism that was, in many ways, more searching and more serious about its subject than the Scientology episode, concluding not with mockery, but with a strange and genuine respect for the social and familial good that religious community can produce, even when its founding stories are implausible. The thing that made Scientology different was not its beliefs, it was its behavior toward critics, the systematic legal and social pressure deployed against anyone who spoke critically about the organization, the way the institution had arranged for its own protection by making the cost of criticism high enough that most institutions chose silence. That arrangement was the extremism the episode was targeting. The beliefs were the vehicle, the power was the point. This distinction matters because it connects the Scientology episode to the show's broader political project in a way that surface readings of the episode tend to miss. The show was not anti-religious, it was anti-authoritarian, consistently and across every episode it ever made about organized power. The thing that drew Parker and Stone to Scientology was the same thing that drew them to every other target they found most irresistible, which was the structure of exemption the organization had built around itself, the implicit or explicit message that criticism was not permitted, that the usual social contract in which public figures and institutions were fair game for public examination did not apply. The show's entire political and satirical project was a refusal of that exemption. It refused the exemption for governments, for celebrities, for political movements, for parents, for the medical establishment, for the entertainment industry itself, and for religious organizations, and it refused it most loudly precisely for the organizations that had done the most to enforce it. The aftermath of the episode unfolded in slow motion over the following years. Comedy Central eventually made the episode fully available again, and it has remained accessible. Isaac Hayes' legacy was treated with evident care by the show's subsequent handling of Chef's absence. His character neither rehabilitated nor further degraded. Parker and Stone did not return to Scientology as a subject for many years, which some observers read as a retreat, and others read as the show having said what it needed to say and moving on. The Emmy nomination gave the episode an institutional legitimacy that made it harder to treat as mere provocation, and the episode's most lasting contribution to the show's political project was a single sentence delivered by Stan near the end of the story. Stan, increasingly uncomfortable with the leadership position the church has pressed upon him, finally delivers a speech in which he declines the role they have assigned him and tells the gathered Scientologists what he thinks of the situation. He tells them that the religion they have built is based on a science fiction story, that the people running it know this, and that the whole enterprise is a mechanism for taking money from its members. He offers them a chance to sue him. The episode ends with a frozen frame and the words coming next week, "We'll be taking on Scientology," and the message that the show signed its name to the statement Stan had just made. Parker and Stone were not hiding. They had made an episode. They had named what they believed about the organization, and they invited the legal consequences. The consequences, ultimately, did not arrive in the form of a lawsuit. What arrived instead was a quieter kind of pressure, applied through the channels that a sufficiently powerful institution has available to it. And the show absorbed the pressure, paid the cost that came with it, and continued. The lesson the show drew from the Scientology episode, and the lesson it has applied since, is that the extremism of protected power is the most important variety of extremism to name, precisely because it is the variety that has arranged for its own invisibility. The political extremists that fill the rest of the show's catalog are mostly visible. They march, they organize, they hold signs and give speeches, and make themselves available for mockery. The Church of Scientology worked differently, and the work it did to protect itself from the kind of exposure the episode provided was itself a form of the extremism the show was built to oppose. Trapped in the Closet is not the show's funniest episode. It is in some ways its most serious one, a half hour of animation that ended with a real departure, a real institution applying real real pressure, and two creators choosing to stand at the end of it exactly where they had stood at the beginning. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Trapped in the Closet showed what happened when the show targeted a protected institution, and the protected institution pushed back in ways that cost something real. Next, the show turns to a different kind of untouchable, not an organization but an idea, and to the most complicated editorial mistake the program ever made, one that it was brave enough to spend 12 years correcting in public. Section 5, Man Bear Pig and the Apology That Took 12 Years. South Park has built its reputation on being the show that never backs down, the program that names the thing no one else will name and then holds its position regardless of the consequences. That reputation is largely deserved. Parker and Stone have faced threats, lawsuits, departing cast members, network interference, and pressure from governments, and they have generally absorbed the pressure and continued. But there is one episode in the show's history that tells a different story. A story not about holding a position under fire, but about getting something genuinely wrong, recognizing the error over time, and doing something that neither creator is particularly associated with in the public mind, which is admitting it clearly, on screen, in front of the audience that had been watching. The original episode was called Man Bear Pig, and it aired on the 12th of April in 2006, the 6th episode of season 10. In the episode, former Vice President Al Gore arrives in South Park to warn the town about a creature he describes as half man, half bear, and half pig, a monster that he has dedicated his life to hunting and that he believes represents the greatest threat facing humanity. The boys are unimpressed. Stan, acting as the episode's moral center in the way he usually does, investigates the claim and finds no evidence for the creature's existence. He confronts Gore directly, and his verdict is delivered in a speech that the episode treats as the reasonable conclusion of a reasonable investigation. Gore is using Man Bear Pig, Stan tells him, as a way of getting attention for himself because he is a loser who lost a presidential election and cannot move on. The monster is not real. The campaign to fight it is not genuine concern. It is the wounded vanity of a failed politician looking for a way to feel important again. The creature Man Bear Pig was a metaphor for man-made climate change, and the episode was aired approximately 1 month before the release of Al Gore's documentary about global warming, An Inconvenient Truth, which had been generating significant media attention as it approached its theatrical premiere. The show's position was that Gore's alarm about climate change was self-serving rather than sincere, that the documentary was a vanity project dressed as environmental advocacy, and that the scientific warnings being packaged inside it were exaggerated to serve the presenter's emotional needs. This was not a fringe position in 2006 among a certain strain of political commentary that the show had some sympathy with, the libertarian-adjacent skepticism of government-affiliated alarmism that Parker and Stone had expressed in other contexts. The episode fit the formula. Gore was an extremist, in the show's taxonomy, a man whose certainty had curdled into something that served himself rather than his stated cause. Man Bear Pig was the smug cloud applied to climate science. The episode was funny and well constructed, and it was wrong. Not wrong in the way that satire is sometimes wrong when it simplifies a complex situation, which is a forgivable and expected limitation of the form. Wrong in the factual sense, about a scientific question that the intervening 12 years between the episode and its correction resolved with increasing clarity. The warming that Gore's documentary described as a coming catastrophe was not an exaggeration produced by a loser's wounded pride. It was a real and accelerating phenomenon, documented with mounting precision by the scientific community in the years following the episode's broadcast, and the consequences that Gore had warned about began arriving on schedule. Man Bear Pig was real. The episode had told its audience otherwise, and the audience was large. Parker and Stone were aware of this. The show has, across its run, demonstrated a capacity for self-reflection that its abrasiveness tends to obscure. They did not return to the subject immediately. 12 years is a long time to sit with a mistake, and the show occupied itself during those years with other political territory. But in October and November of 2018, in the 6th and 7th episodes of season 22, titled Time to Get Cereal and Nobody Got Cereal, Man Bear Pig returned to South Park, and this time he was real. The creature arrives in the first episode and begins killing people. The boys, who dismissed Gore's warnings the first time, are forced to go and find him and ask for his help, because he is the only one who knows what Man Bear Pig actually is and how to address it. Gore agrees to help, but only on one condition, which is that the boys apologize to him for not listening. The apology scene is the episode's center of gravity. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny stand in front of the former vice president and tell him that he was right and they were wrong. The show presents this without irony and without the usual escape hatch of having the apology immediately undercut by something absurd. The boys are genuinely contrite. Gore is genuinely owed the apology. The acknowledgement is real. real. The second episode develops the metaphor with additional darkness. The people of South Park understand that Man-Bear-Pig is real, that the danger is genuine, and that addressing it will require sacrifice and disruption. They come to the edge of making the necessary changes. They commit, briefly, to doing what is needed, and then they choose not to. The specific thing they cannot give up is a video game, Red Dead Redemption 2, which the episode presents as the comfort of the moment, the immediate pleasure that crowds out the longer-term response. The town decides it would rather keep playing the game than address the crisis. Man-Bear-Pig will return, the episode implies, because the people who need to act have chosen not to. The apology for the past is genuine. The change in behavior for the future is insufficient. This structure is more sophisticated than a simple correction would have been. The show did not just say it was wrong. It dramatized the full arc of the error, from the original dismissal through the forced recognition, through the incomplete response, to the ongoing consequence. It showed what it looks like when people understand a problem and still cannot bring themselves to do what the problem requires, because the sacrifice is immediate and the disaster is not. The episode is more pessimistic than the apology makes it appear. It corrects the original error and then immediately suggests that the correction will not be enough, that knowing the truth and acting on the truth are different things, and that the gap between them is where the real damage accumulates. Al Gore himself was asked about the episodes on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, and his response was generous. He praised the creators for what he described as a significant statement, the willingness to acknowledge publicly that the original episode had been wrong. He understood the weight of that acknowledgement for two people whose public identity was built on never backing down, and he received it in the spirit it was offered. The praise was not reciprocal flattery. Gore had been mocked on television in front of millions of people, and the substance of the mockery had told those people that the most important warning he had ever delivered was a performance of wounded vanity. Having the show reverse that judgment publicly, 12 years later, was worth something. What the Man-Bear-Pig arc reveals about the show's relationship to political extremism is something that the show's admirers have generally been reluctant to examine. The original episode made the error that the show most consistently warned against in others, which is allowing a prior commitment to a position to override the available evidence. Parker and Stone were skeptical of Gore, and the skepticism was partly aesthetic, partly ideological, and partly personal given their documented interest in puncturing celebrity self-importance. That skepticism led them to dismiss the scientific consensus he was communicating, along with the messenger they found ridiculous. The smug cloud critique, the Man-Bear-Pig dismissal, and the general anti-alarmist posture of the show in its middle period were all expressions of the same underlying preference for the position that established authorities were crying wolf. Sometimes they are. In this case, they were not, and the show eventually said so. The correction also quietly illuminates something about the show's both sides formula that the formula's defenders tend to overlook. The formula assumes that the extremists on each side are equivalent in their harm, that the environmental alarmist and the climate denier are producing the same quality of distortion and deserve the same satirical treatment. The Man-Bear-Pig correction is a tacit acknowledgement that this assumption can fail, that there are situations in which one side has the evidence and the other does not, and that a show committed to mocking both sides equally can, in those situations, end up doing something worse than failing to be funny. It can end up providing cover for the side that is wrong, giving that side the social legitimacy of a popular satirical endorsement, normalizing the dismissal of a genuine warning by packaging it as reasonable skepticism. Parker and Stone did not articulate all of this explicitly in the corrective episode. The show is not given to explicit self-analysis of that kind, but the structure of the correction contained the analysis within it. By having the boys apologize to Gore, by having Man-Bear-Pig arrive and prove real, by having the town acknowledge the truth and then fail to act on it, the show was staging a small drama about what it costs to have been wrong about something important, and about the difficulty of converting the knowledge that you were wrong into the changed behavior that the knowledge demands. The correction was more honest than many corrections because it did not pretend that acknowledging an error resolves it. It showed the acknowledgement and then showed the continuing failure, and left the two things sitting side by side in a way that the audience had to decide what to do with. What the 12-year gap between the original episode and the correction says about the show is worth sitting with. The show had ample opportunity before 2018 to revisit Man-Bear-Pig. The scientific evidence that would have supported a correction was accumulating steadily throughout that period. The decision to wait until 2018 was not a decision to deny the evidence. It was a decision about timing, about when the correction had become unavoidable, when the gap between what the show had said and what was plainly true had grown wide enough that leaving it uncorrected would itself have become a statement. By 2018, with the physical evidence of warming impossible to dismiss, and with the political landscape around climate change having shifted dramatically, the correction had become the honest choice in a way that it perhaps had not been in 2010 or 2012 or 2014. The show waited until the correction was necessary and then made it, which is less heroic than making it early, but considerably more honest than not making it at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Man Bear Pig showed that the show's formula could fail, that both sides' symmetry breaks down when one side has the evidence and the other does not. Next, the show confronts a different kind of failure entirely, the one that happens not when it gets the facts wrong, but when the facts are correct, and the institution it depends on refuses to let it say them anyway. Section 6. Cartoon Wars and the Line That Moves. Something had been building inside South Park for years, before it finally arrived in the spring of 2006, 2 weeks after Smug Alert, and in the same 10th season that would also contain Man Bear Pig. The something was a question the show had been circling since its earliest days without quite landing on it directly, a question about where the limits of its own premise actually were. The show had declared, by its behavior over 9 seasons, that no subject was exempt from its attention, and no institution was protected from its satire. It had mocked Christianity and Judaism and Islam and Buddhism and Mormonism and Scientology and every other organized belief system it encountered. It had depicted Jesus Christ as a recurring character, a mild-mannered man who occasionally performed miracles and more often struggled with ordinary life. It had shown Moses as a glowing geometric shape. It had placed the Buddha in a superhero team. The premise was total equality of treatment, every faith subjected to the same irreverence, no religion receiving the protection of a special exemption. The question the show had been avoiding, and the one that Cartoon Wars finally forced into the open, was whether that premise was actually being honored, or whether there was one exception the show had quietly been making that it had not fully acknowledged even to itself. Cartoon Wars was broadcast in 2 parts, the 3rd and 4th episodes of Season 10, airing on the 5th and 12th of April in 2006. The episodes were inspired by the Jyllands-Posten controversy, which had begun in September of 2005 when a Danish newspaper published 12 editorial cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad, several of them in ways that many Muslims around the world found deeply offensive. The controversy had escalated through early 2006 into widespread protests, some of which became violent, and in several countries the demonstrations had resulted in deaths and the burning of embassies. The question of whether a newspaper had the right to publish images of Muhammad and whether other media organizations had an obligation to reproduce those images in coverage of the controversy had become one of the central free speech debates of the era. The setup of the 2-part episode wove this real-world controversy into a fictional one involving the animated series Family Guy, which on the show was preparing to air an episode that would depict Muhammad. The fictional Fox network that airs Family Guy within South Park is considering whether to broadcast the episode or pull it in response to threats of violence. The town of South Park responds to the news by descending into panic, barricading itself in the community center, and burying its collective head literally in sand pits, a choice the show frames as the most cowardly option available, but also the most comprehensible given the circumstances. Meanwhile, Cartman, who hates Family Guy and wants the show canceled, sees the Muhammad controversy as the perfect vehicle for accomplishing his goal and races to the Fox network headquarters in Los Angeles to use the threat of Muslim retaliation as leverage for getting the program pulled. Kyle follows him, having realized what Cartman is actually doing, and races to stop him. The argument at the center of the 2 episodes is delivered most clearly by Kyle in the Fox president's office. Kyle tells the president that pulling the Family Guy episode would be a capitulation to terrorism, that the moment any organization changes its behavior in response to violent threats, it hands those threats their power, that free expression is only meaningful if it does not exempt subjects based on the willingness of their adherents to use violence against those who engage with them. The president of Fox in the episode eventually agrees. He decides to air the Muhammad scene. The episode is broadcast within the episode, and then the screen cuts to black because Comedy Central, the real network airing the real South Park, had refused to allow the depiction. The cut to black was not an accident and was not something Parker and Stone accepted without a fight. They had wanted to show Muhammad. They had argued with Comedy Central and its parent company Viacom for the right to do so. The network's position was that showing the image posed a genuine safety risk to the people who work there and potentially to others, a position that the context of early 2006 made difficult to dismiss as mere corporate timidity. People had died in the protests. Embassies had burned. The calculus was not abstract, but the network's refusal meant that South Park's most explicit argument for free speech had been made in an episode that demonstrated, by the fact of its own censorship, that the argument had not been won. The show turned this into the most pointed moment of the whole 2-part story. After the cut to black, when the fictional episode of Family Guy returns from the Muhammad scene, the terrorists who had threatened retaliation respond by releasing their own cartoon cartoon, a short film depicting Americans and Jesus defecating on each other and on the American flag. The show then made its central observation visible by simply letting the scene stand. Comedy Central would not allow South Park to show Muhammad. It had allowed, over 9 seasons, countless depictions of Jesus in degrading or comic situations. The network's standard was not consistent. The asymmetry was the argument, and the censorship of the episode made the argument more powerfully than any line of dialogue could have. This asymmetry had been present in the show's own history in a way that Cartoon Wars was partly designed to acknowledge. In 2001, in the 5th season episode Super Best Friends, Muhammad had appeared as a character without any controversy at all, depicted as a member of a team of religious figures who used their combined powers to fight evil. He had fire powers. He was treated like any other member of the group. Nobody protested. The episode aired without incident and was rerun without incident and stayed available on the show's website and streaming platforms for years. It was only after Cartoon Wars and the broader controversy around depicting Muhammad that the earlier episode was quietly pulled from circulation, not because anything had changed about its content, but because the context around it had changed. The pulling of Super Best Friends illustrated exactly the dynamic Cartoon Wars was describing, which is that the threat of violence had succeeded in altering what could be said and shown, that the line had moved, and that it had moved in response to the most extreme version of the pressure being applied. The Cartoon Wars episodes were praised widely as the show's most direct statement about free speech, and that praise is accurate as far as it goes. But the episodes are also doing something more specific than a general defense of the principle. They are pointing at an inconsistency that the show believed ran through the media institutions, including the one broadcasting South Park, and through the culture more broadly. The inconsistency was that the principle of free expression, which everyone claimed to support in the abstract, was in practice applied unevenly, with certain targets more available for satire than others, and the determining factor in who was available was not the quality of the argument being made or the accuracy of the satirical point, but the credibility of the threat attached to criticism. Christianity was available because American Christians, however offended by a given episode, were not going to kill anyone over it. Scientology was available, up to a point, because the risk it posed was legal rather than physical. Muhammad was not available in 2006, and the show believed this was the wrong reason to draw a line. The wrong reason to draw a line, in the show's taxonomy, is fear. The right reason to draw a line is an honest assessment of the harm your speech will cause, which is a judgment the show was perfectly capable of making, and did make, in both directions, across its run. The distinction the show was insisting on was between a line drawn through ethical reasoning and a line drawn through intimidation. 4 years after Cartoon Wars, in the 14th season, the show returned to the same territory in its 200th and 201st episodes, broadcast in April of 2010, and built around a plot in which all the celebrities South Park had ever mocked sued the town. The celebrities discovered that Muhammad had never been mocked by the show and demanded that he be produced so that he could be mocked equally with everyone else, or alternatively, that his power of protection from mockery be transferred to them. The episodes depicted Muhammad hidden inside a bear costume, and the name was bleeped throughout. Before the second episode aired, an organization called Revolution Muslim posted a message online stating that Parker and Stone could meet the same fate as a Dutch filmmaker who had been murdered after making a film critical of Islam. Police presence at Comedy Central's offices was elevated in response. Comedy Central's response to the threat was to censor the episodes more heavily than any previous South Park installment. Muhammad's name was bleeped even when spoken in neutral contexts. His image, already hidden in the bear costume, was covered with a black bar. And Kyle's closing speech, the traditional moral of the episode address that had been a fixture of the show since its earliest seasons, was bleeped in its entirety. The speech, which Parker and Stone later confirmed had made no mention of Muhammad at all, was bleeped preemptively, removing the moral of an episode about censorship using the mechanism of censorship. Both episodes were subsequently pulled from streaming, removed from the show's website, and have not been made available in any official format since. Parker and Stone's response was a public statement expressing that they were, to use the word Stone had used in an interview about the Cartoon Wars situation, disappointed. They did not sue Comedy Central. They did not leave the show. They continued producing South Park, and the subject of Muhammad's depiction has not been revisited in the seasons that followed, which some observers have taken as evidence that the intimidation succeeded where it was meant to succeed. What the whole arc from Cartoon Wars to the banned episodes of 2010 demonstrates about South Park's relationship to political extremism is a distinction the show drew with unusual clarity between two categories of extremists. There are extremists the show can mock freely because the consequences of mocking them, however unpleasant, are manageable. Protests, boycotts, angry letters, occasional litigation. And there are extremists the show cannot mock freely because the consequences of mocking them include credible threats of physical harm harm to real people. The show's position has always been that this distinction should not exist, that the threatening extremist and the non-threatening extremist should be equally available for satire, because allowing the threat to determine the availability of the subject hands the most violent faction in any given group the power to define the group's relationship to public discourse. But the show's position and the show's behavior in the actual world, where threats have physical consequences, have not always been the same thing. The line that moved in 2006 and moved further in 2010 has not moved back. The episodes remain unavailable. The subject has not been revisited. The show that declared total equality of treatment across all institutions and all belief systems has, in this specific case, been forced by the reality of violence and the reality of network liability into a de facto exception, exactly the exception it spent 2 episodes arguing against. The argument stands. The exception also stands. They are both true at the same time, and the coexistence of the correct argument and the incorrect outcome is the most honest thing the show has ever had to say about the limits of what satire can accomplish when the thing it is trying to satirize is prepared to kill. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Cartoon Wars drew the clearest line the show ever drew about free speech, and then the real world demonstrated that the line could be overridden by something the formula had no answer for. Next, the show turns inward, building an entire season around a different kind of extremism, the kind that arrives wearing the language of progress and builds its power by making dissent feel like cruelty. Section 7, PC Principle and the Extremism of Enforcement. Sometime around 2014 and 2015, something shifted in the atmosphere of American campus and online culture in a way that Parker and Stone found irresistible. The shift was not in the underlying values being discussed, which were largely the same progressive commitments the culture had been working through for decades. The shift was in the enforcement mechanism, the way those values were being applied, the social and institutional pressure that had begun attaching itself to speech and expression and casual conversation in ways that felt to many people, including the 2 men who made South Park, qualitatively different from what had come before. Safe spaces were being established at university. Trigger warnings were being issued before classroom discussions of difficult historical material. The phrase politically correct, which had been in circulation since the early 90s, had acquired a new intensity, a new institutional backing, a new willingness to punish rather than merely disapprove. Parker and Stone had made fun of political correctness before. The show had been doing it since its first season, in the way it treated the town's various sensitivity campaigns and moral panics. But by 2015, they sensed that the phenomenon had developed into something worth examining at full length, across an entire season, in the form of a character who could embody it completely and be followed into all its implications. The character arrived in the 19th season premiere, an episode called Stunning and Brave, which broadcast on the 16th of September in 2015. His name was PC Principal, and he replaced the school's existing administrator, Principal Victoria, who was removed from her position by the school board under circumstances the episode initially left unexplained. PC Principal's real name, revealed much later, is Peter Charles. He is a large, muscular, athletic man, a graduate of Texas A&M University, a member of a fraternity of like-minded enforcers who call themselves the PC Bros. He arrives at South Park Elementary and delivers an opening assembly speech that takes immediate inventory of everything the town has said and done over its entire history, every offensive episode, every slur, every insensitive moment, and announces that the era of getting away with it is over. He is passionate. He is, in his own understanding, righteous. He is also prepared to resolve disagreements through physical violence, and he does, repeatedly, beginning in his first episode when he beats Cartman bloody in a bathroom for referring to Caitlyn Jenner without the word hero attached. The irony that the show stages in that moment and sustains throughout the season is that a man committed to the elimination of bullying and the protection of the vulnerable has become the most aggressive bully in town, that the enforcement of a philosophy of inclusion has been handed to someone who excludes through force anyone who fails to comply. The season built PC Principal into a satirical portrait rather than a simple villain, and the distinction is worth preserving because the show's critics on the left have sometimes read the character as a straightforward attack on progressive values rather than on a specific way of enacting them. PC Principal does not represent the belief that people should be treated with dignity and that language matters. He represents the transformation of those beliefs into an enforcement regime, the point at which caring about inclusion became a system for producing conformity, in which the stated goal of making people feel safe was achieved through the very mechanism, institutional intimidation, that the philosophy of safety was supposedly designed to resist. Kyle is the season's moral conscience on this question, which is consistent with his function throughout the show's run as the character most willing to say the unpopular truth thing. Kyle objects to the way PC culture is operating in South Park, not because he disagrees with its underlying commitments, but because he can see that the version of it being enforced by PC Principal is producing the opposite of the open intellectual environment it claims to be creating. He writes an editorial for the school newspaper arguing this. The editorial is suppressed. Jimmy, the show's character who edits the paper, is told by PC Principal that certain positions are not publishable because publishing them would cause harm to vulnerable people. The definition of harm that PC Principal is working from is elastic enough to cover any argument he finds inconvenient. Jimmy's instinct, as a journalist, is to resist the suppression. The season makes him a secondary protagonist, a character navigating the tension between the genuine harm that some speech causes and the genuine harm that speech suppression causes. Two real concerns that the show refuses to collapse into each other. The season's deeper argument, which emerged across its 10 episodes and culminated in the finale, was that the enforcement of political correctness at South Park Elementary was not an autonomous development. It was a product. Something had installed PC Principal and the PC Bros as the town's new authority. Something was using the culture of enforced sensitivity as a mechanism for achieving a different goal entirely, which turned out to be the suppression of the critical thinking capacity that allows consumers to distinguish advertising from genuine information. The show's villain for the season was not political correctness itself, but the entity that had discovered political correctness as a useful tool for making populations docile and easily managed. The enforced sensitivity was producing, as one character describes it, a population afraid to speak out for fear of being called racist or stupid, and that suppression of dissent was what the actual beneficiary of the whole system was after. Compliant consumers are more valuable than critical ones, and the machinery of enforced virtue was producing compliance with remarkable efficiency. This argument was the show's most structurally ambitious political statement since the douche and turd episode a decade earlier. It took the surface phenomenon, the PC culture wars of 2015, and read through them to an economic motive that the surface debates tended to obscure. The critics of political correctness in the real world were, in 2015, largely coming from the right, and their critiques often served agendas that had nothing to do with free intellectual inquiry and everything to do with protecting specific positions from accountability. Parker and Stone were aware of this, and the season took pains to ensure that the critique of PC enforcement was not a celebration of the things PC enforcement was trying to constrain. PC Principal's excesses are real and damaging in the show's world. Cartman's racism, which PC Principal is trying to suppress, is also real and damaging. The show holds both of these at once, refusing to let the excesses of enforcement become a validation of the behavior being enforced against. PC Principal himself undergoes a more complex development than his first appearance suggests. He is, by the end of the season, not quite the straightforward satirical target he appeared to be at the start. He has a genuine commitment to the values he professes, even if his methods are indefensible, and the season finale reveals that he too has been manipulated by the larger machinery the show is identifying. He ends the season fighting against the thing that had been using him, which complicates the audience's relationship to him in a way the show clearly intended. He is not a hypocrite in the way that many of the show's targets are hypocrites. He believes in what he is doing. That makes him, in some ways, more dangerous than the cynical opportunist, and also more sympathetic, because the distance between genuine belief and the harm it causes in practice is one of the oldest and saddest gaps in human moral experience. The character proved durable enough that Parker and Stone kept him, originally intending him as a one-episode figure. He has appeared across subsequent seasons in a modified form, his methods somewhat tempered by what the season 19 arc put him through, his underlying convictions intact. He became the father of a series of characters called the PC Babies, small infants who scream and wail at the slightest exposure to anything they find offensive, and who became the show's emblem for a particular variety of fragility that it associated with the extremist wing of the sensitivity movement. The PC Babies are the logical endpoint of the safe space philosophy, human beings so comprehensively protected from discomfort that any contact with a challenging idea produces immediate crisis. The show presents them as the unintended product of well-meaning protection taken past its useful limit, the place where the instinct to shield vulnerable people from harm transforms into the production of people incapable of functioning without that shield. What season 19 understood about political correctness as a form of extremism is something that the show's critics have been reluctant to grant it credit for, which is that the critique was never about the values themselves. The show has never argued that language does not matter, that representation is unimportant, that institutions should be free to discriminate without social consequence. These are positions the show's own history contradicts. It has made episodes defending gay rights, trans identity, the dignity of disabled people, and the rights of marginalized groups across dozens of installments over nearly 3 decades. decades. The critique in Season 19 is not a critique of those values. It is a critique of what happens when those values are handed to an enforcement mechanism rather than a persuasion mechanism, when the goal shifts from bringing people toward an understanding to punishing those who have not yet arrived at it. The enforcer always loses something in the act of enforcing, and what PC Principal loses is the capacity to persuade. No one who has been beaten in a bathroom is going to be genuinely convinced that the person who beat them has a point worth considering. The intimidation produces surface compliance rather than genuine understanding, a population that says the correct things in public while thinking the incorrect things in private, which is the worst possible outcome for any philosophy that depends on people actually internalizing its commitments. The show's argument is not that PC culture failed because its values were wrong. It is that the enforcement mechanism was counterproductive to the values it was supposed to serve, that you cannot beat people into treating each other with dignity and expect dignity to result. This argument sits in interesting tension with the show's broader political project, because the show has itself been accused, with some justice, of producing content that makes certain forms of cruelty feel more socially acceptable by packaging them as irreverence. The question of whether South Park's mockery of marginalized groups over the years has done the kind of cultural damage that PC Principal was ostensibly trying to prevent is a real question that the show has never answered to everyone's satisfaction. Season 19 did not answer it either. It staged a critique of one kind of extremism without fully reckoning with the ways its own history might have contributed to the conditions that made that extremism feel necessary to its proponents. The gap between the critique and the self-examination is visible, and it is not small. But the season's lasting contribution to the show's political argument is the character of PC Principal as an emblem of the enforcer who believes so completely in the rightness of his cause that the methods become invisible to him, whose certainty about the destination has blinded him to what the journey is doing to the people around him. He is recognizable. He is present in every ideological movement that has ever existed. The person who carries the genuine commitment of the movement but has located all of its costs in the people who resist and none of them in the act of forcing. That figure is not a creature of the left or the right. He is a creature of certainty. And certainty, in South Park's political universe, has always been the thing most worth watching. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. PC Principal showed what happens when the language of inclusion becomes an enforcement mechanism. Certainty doing the work that persuasion should have done. Next, the show confronts a different kind of political extremism, one that does not announce itself as ideology at all, but arrives in the soft, sweet voice of nostalgia, whispering about a time when things were better, and everything that has changed since then is a mistake. Section 8, Member Berries and the Nostalgia Weapon. There is a particular kind of political feeling that does not call itself political. It does not organize around a platform or a candidate or a set of policy positions. It organizes around a feeling, specifically the feeling that things used to be better, that the world the speaker remembers from childhood or early adulthood was more comprehensible, more decent, more organized around the correct values, and that the people and forces responsible for changing that world have taken something that cannot easily be named but is viscerally and constantly missed. This feeling has always existed in human political life. Historians have documented it across centuries and across every kind of political system. But in 2016, with a presidential election approaching that would ultimately produce one of the most unexpected results in modern American political history, South Park identified a version of this feeling that it found particularly worth examining, gave it a physical form, and named it. The name was Member Berry. The physical form was a small purple fruit, the size and appearance of a grape, that spoke in a soothing voice and said things like "member" when things were simpler, and "member" the original trilogy, and "member" when you didn't have to be so careful about everything you said. The berries were introduced in the 20th season premiere, an episode called Member Berries, which aired on the 14th of September in 2016. They were immediately addictive. The adults of South Park consumed them compulsively, finding in their gentle stream of nostalgic affirmation a relief from the anxiety and confusion of the present moment. The berries reminded people of things they loved, things from decades past, simpler pleasures, uncomplicated cultural touchstones. And then, gradually, the reminders darkened. As the season progressed and the member berries accumulated in the bloodstream of the town's adult population, the content of their whispers shifted. The warm cultural memories began mixing with political memories, and the political memories were not neutral. The berries began reminding their consumers of a time before certain social changes, before the expansions of civil rights and the alterations of cultural norms that had occurred over the preceding decades. They began reminding people of when things were the way they used to be, a phrase whose specific content was left deliberately vague because its power came not from specificity, but from the emotional charge of the vagueness, the sense of a prior wholeness that the present had disrupted without the listener having to name exactly what that wholeness contained or who it excluded. By the end of the season, the member berries had accumulated enough influence that their leader was found at the Pentagon, discussing plans to restore the original order of things. The berries were not merely a comfort product. They were a political technology, a mechanism for converting diffuse nostalgia into actionable resentment, for taking the feeling that something had been lost and directing it towards specific targets without ever having to be honest about what the something was or who had benefited from the changes that produced its loss. The show was describing, in the form of talking fruit, a real phenomenon in the political psychology of 2016. The way that appeals to a vaguely remembered better past had become a primary instrument of political mobilization, and the way that vagueness was the instrument's most important feature rather than an incidental weakness. The member berries ran alongside the season's presidential election storyline, in which the Republican candidate was represented by Mr. Garrison, South Park's long-running character who had begun the series as the boys' eccentric elementary school teacher and had over the years gone through a series of transformations, including a gender transition and eventual reversion, that made him one of the show's most unstable and unpredictable recurring figures. Garrison was running on a platform whose signature promise was delivered in language too crude to reproduce in this context, but whose import was the expulsion of immigrants through spectacular violence. He did not want the job he was seeking. He had stumbled into the candidacy accidentally, had expected to be rejected by the electorate, and was experiencing mounting horror as it became clear that the electorate was not going to reject him. The show was depicting a political phenomenon it found genuinely confusing, a candidate whose appeal defied the usual explanations, whose support persisted through statements and behaviors that would have ended any conventional political career. The season was the most ambitious long-form storytelling South Park had attempted, building a continuous narrative across all 10 episodes rather than the semi-connected arcs of previous seasons. It was also, by Parker and Stone's own subsequent admission, the season that most clearly illustrated the limits of their formula. The show had planned to end the season with Garrison losing the election, as the real-world candidate the character represented was widely expected to lose. When the actual election results came in, on the night of the 8th of November 2016, the writers were in the middle of producing the finale. The episode they had planned became impossible, not because it said the wrong thing, but because the event it had been structured around did not occur. Parker and Stone have spoken about this moment with unusual openness. They described a genuine creative crisis, the show's formula failing at the precise moment it was most needed, the both sides mechanism breaking down under the weight of an actual historical outcome that the formula had not anticipated. The finale they produced instead was called Not Suitable for Children, which aired on the 7th of December and depicted the morning after the election with a deliberate flatness, characters moving through a world that had changed overnight in ways they could not fully process. Parker said afterward that the show had made the same mistake he believed much of the media had made, which was to find the candidate so absurd that it treated him as a joke rather than as a serious political possibility, and that this treatment had, in some small way, contributed to the environment in which the unexpected outcome became possible. The member berries storyline survived the season's structural collapse better than the Garrison storyline did, because the member berries were operating at a different level of abstraction. They were not about a specific candidate or a specific election. They were about the psychological infrastructure that a certain kind of political extremism requires to function, the emotional preparation that happens before a population is ready to follow someone to a destination they would not have chosen in a calmer moment. The nostalgia that the berries supplied was the softening agent, the thing that made the harder content go down more easily, that made the resentment feel like memory rather than grievance, and the anger feel like loss rather than hostility. What the show understood, and what the member berries were designed to express, is that nostalgia is not politically neutral. The feeling of having lost something precious is real and deserves to be taken seriously, but the political use of that feeling, the act of channeling it towards specific targets and specific remedies, is always a choice, and it is a choice that tends to serve the interests of whoever is doing the channeling rather than the interests of the people experiencing the loss. The member berries whisper warmly about beloved films and television programs and then slide, almost imperceptibly, into whispers about demographic change and social transformation, and the slide is not accidental. It is the mechanism. The cultural nostalgia is the entry point. The political nostalgia is the destination. The show was also, in the member berries season, conducting a specific self-examination that it made visible primarily through Stan. Stan watches the adults consuming the berries and consuming the nostalgia, and watches the town being prepared for something it does not fully understand, and he is not able to stop any of it. The show returns here to one of its oldest structural patterns, the children as the clear-eyed observers of adult dysfunction, unable to intervene because the dysfunction is too large and too thoroughly organized around around its own self-perpetuation. Stan's clarity does not help him. The adults are too far into the berries to hear him. The nostalgia has done its work. The season also contained, running alongside the political storylines, the Gerald Broflovsky trolling arc examined in the parent script, in which Kyle's father was revealed to be spending his evenings as an anonymous internet harasser. The two storylines were related thematically in ways the season made explicit. Both the nostalgic voter and the anonymous troll are people who have found, through the tools available to them, a way to act out a grievance with the present world without being accountable for the action. The memberberry consumer wraps their resentment in the language of fond memory. The troll wraps their cruelty in anonymity. Both are using a technological or psychological mechanism to escape the consequences of what they are actually doing, and both are producing real harm in the world, while maintaining a self-image that does not include the harm. The memberberries reappeared in subsequent episodes, their influence on the town's politics continuing in the background of later seasons. The show never fully resolved the storyline in the way it resolved some of its other extended arcs, perhaps because the phenomenon the berries were describing had not resolved in the real world either. Nostalgia as a political weapon did not retire after 2016. It continued operating, in slightly different forms, in subsequent election cycles, and the show's portrait of it remained accurate enough that the berries needed no reintroduction when they were referenced in later seasons. What the memberberries contributed to the show's long argument about political extremism is a recognition that the most effective variety of extremism is often the kind that does not announce itself as extreme at all. PC Principal announces his agenda loudly in assembly speeches and punitive actions that make his position impossible to misread. The smug environmentalist is visibly, identifiably smug, his condescension a public performance that anyone nearby can see and name. The memberberry speaks quietly, in a voice designed to sound like comfort rather than ideology, and the people it addresses feel themselves being soothed rather than manipulated. The extremism that arrives wearing the face of nostalgia is the hardest variety to resist, because resisting it requires arguing against a feeling, and feelings are more persuasive than arguments to people who are frightened and confused and missing something they cannot quite name. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Memberberries showed extremism arriving in the softest possible voice, nostalgia doing the work that anger would have done too visibly. Next, the show takes its political argument outside American borders entirely and discovers that some varieties of extremism are large enough to silence a television program simply by deciding to. Section 9. Banned in China and the extremism of economic power. Every variety of political extremism the show had examined up to this point shared a common quality, which is that it was legible. The smug liberal, the fanatical environmentalist, the enforcing PC warrior, the nostalgic authoritarian, the religious institution that litigates its critics into silence. All of these are recognizable as political actors. They make claims about the world, they organize around those claims, and they apply pressure in ways that can be identified and named and, in South Park's case, satirized. The extremism that arrived in 2019 in the form of the Chinese government's relationship to American entertainment was different in kind from all of these, because it operated not through ideology or intimidation in the conventional sense, but through the most basic mechanism of economic leverage imaginable. It did not need to make an argument. It did not need to threaten violence. It simply needed to be large enough that the prospect of losing access to it changed how American institutions behave, and it was exactly that large, and they behaved exactly that way. South Park had spent 22 seasons going after every variety of institutional power it could find on American soil. In October of 2019, with the 23rd season episode Banned in China, it extended that project across the Pacific, and the result was the most internationally consequential single episode the show had ever produced. Not because the episode was its most artistically accomplished, but because the response to it confirmed, with a precision that no work of fiction could have manufactured, every argument the episode was making. The episode aired on the 2nd of October in 2019. It followed Randy Marsh, deep in the Tagrity Farms marijuana storyline that had been running since the previous season, as he traveled to China to open new markets for his product. Once in China, Randy was arrested and placed in a labor camp, where he encountered a population of prisoners that included Winnie the Pooh, the bear character from A.A. Milne's stories, who had been banned from Chinese internet platforms after users noted a facial resemblance between the character and President Xi Jinping. The labor camp section of the episode depicted conditions that the show presented as grimly realistic: forced labor and arbitrary detention in a system with no meaningful recourse for the detained. Simultaneously, back in the United States, Stan and his friends were pursuing a storyline about forming a band and trying to get their music turned into a biopic film. A Hollywood producer explained to them, with the brisk matter-of-factness of someone describing an ordinary business constraint that for their film to make any money, it needed to clear the Chinese censors, and that clearing the Chinese censors meant removing or avoiding certain subjects. The list the producer enumerated included the Dalai Lama, homosexuality, organ transplants, and Winnie the Pooh. These were not invented constraints. They were the actual categories of content that Chinese censorship regulations had been documented to restrict in imported films. The show was not satirizing a hypothetical. It was describing a real set of conditions that real Hollywood studios were navigating in real production decisions, and the description was specific enough to be verified against public reporting on the subject. The episode's central argument was delivered through the boys' experience of trying to make their film under these conditions. Each time they developed a storyline that felt true to their experience and their world, a producer explained that it would not clear the censor. Each time they adjusted, they lost something. The gay character had to become straight. The plot involving religious practice had to be modified. The film that emerged at the end of the process bore no meaningful relationship to the film they had intended to make, having been hollowed out by the accumulated requirements of an approval process located on the other side of the planet, operated by a government with no accountability to the people whose creative work it was constraining. The episode went further than most Hollywood commentary on the subject was willing to go. Studios with significant financial exposure to the Chinese market had been carefully avoiding public criticism of the censorship regime for years, and the entertainment press, which depends for its access on maintaining relationships with those studios, had generally been cautious about pushing the subject too hard. The result was a kind of collective public silence around a practice that was openly acknowledged in private: the adjusting of American creative work to satisfy a foreign government's ideological requirements in exchange for access to its enormous consumer market. Banned in China named this practice, depicted it with specific accuracy, and made no effort to present it as anything other than what it was, which was a form of censorship so effective it did not need to announce itself, because the studios were performing it voluntarily in pursuit of revenue. The response from China arrived within days of the episode's broadcast. Every mention of South Park disappeared from Chinese internet platform. Episodes that had been available on streaming services were removed. The show's name was scrubbed from social media. Discussion threads on Chinese platforms that had previously hosted conversation about the show were shut down. A search for South Park on Baidu, China's dominant search engine, returned no results. The erasure was comprehensive and swift, executed with the efficiency of a government that had long practiced at removing unwanted content from its digital infrastructure. By the second week of October 2019, South Park had been effectively banned in China, and every clip, episode, and discussion of it had been made inaccessible to Chinese internet users. Parker and Stone responded the following day with a statement they posted to the show's social media accounts entitled "Official Apology to China." The statement said that they welcomed the Chinese censors into their homes and hearts, that they too loved money more than freedom and democracy, that they would forget the Tiananmen Square massacre happened, and that they would carry a torch for authoritarian rule. The statement closed by declaring "Long live the great Communist Party of China" and wishing the censors a happy NBA season, a reference to a simultaneous controversy in which the Houston Rockets general manager had posted a tweet supporting the Hong Kong protests, and the NBA had responded by distancing itself from the statement in an effort to protect its Chinese market relationships. The mock apology was one of the sharpest pieces of satirical writing the show's creators had produced outside of an episode, and its targeting was precise on multiple levels. By mentioning the NBA in the same breath as their own situation, Parker and Stone were drawing an explicit parallel between two American institutions that had been forced into different responses to the same pressure. The NBA had bent, South Park had not. The juxtaposition made the choice visible in a way that neither institution's behavior alone would have achieved. The episode and its aftermath illustrated something about the specific variety of extremism that economic power represents that the show had not previously examined at this scale. Every other form of extremism the show had satirized operated through the conversion of people, through persuasion or intimidation or social pressure, trying to bring individuals or communities around to a position. Economic extremism of the kind China was exercising in its relationship to Hollywood operated differently. It did not need to convince anyone. It did not need to change anyone's mind about anything. It simply needed to make the cost of a particular kind of speech high enough that the people capable of that speech chose silence as the financially rational option. The silence was not coerced in the way that censorship in an authoritarian state is coerced. It was chosen freely and voluntarily by institutions calculating their own interests. The Chinese government did not need to threaten Hollywood directly. Hollywood threatened itself on the government's behalf every time a studio adjusted a script to avoid content that might offend the censors. This is what made Banned in China's argument more unsettling than the show's previous political political commentary, even more than the Muhammad controversy. The Muhammad situation involved threats of physical violence from a fringe organization, and Comedy Central's response, while the show disagreed with it, was at least comprehensible as a response to a genuine physical danger. The Hollywood capitulation to Chinese censorship involved no such threat. The studios were not afraid of being hurt. They were afraid of missing a revenue opportunity, which is a different kind of fear, and in some ways a more corrosive one, because it is harder to resist without appearing to be performing nobility at someone else's expense. The show's position, embedded in the episode and made explicit in the mock apology, was that the choice between access to the Chinese market and the integrity of creative expression was a genuine choice that the industry was making, and that choosing access was not neutral or inevitable, but was a decision with real consequences for the culture the industry was producing. Every film adjusted to satisfy the censors was a film that told its audience, in some encoded way, that certain subjects were not available for honest treatment. Every studio that accepted the adjustment normalized the adjustment for the studios around it. The collective self-censorship produced an environment in which the Chinese government's ideological requirements were shaping American popular culture without the Chinese government having to do anything more than exist as a large and lucrative market. The specific mechanism of this influence had been documented by journalists and researchers in the years before the episode aired, and the episode drew on that documentation to build its satire. Academic analysis published after the episode noted that it served as a piece of what one researcher called soft power reversal, an American entertainment product using the tools of popular culture to expose and resist the way a foreign government was using those same tools to expand its influence. The researcher argued that Banned in China was not merely making a point about censorship, but was actively doing something, using the reach and the irreverence of the show to make the practice visible to an audience that might otherwise have remained unaware of how thoroughly it was operating. The episode also connected to the show's long-running argument about the relationship between money and freedom, an argument that had run in various forms through episodes about corporate influence, media consolidation, and the entertainment industry's relationship to its own values. The show had always been skeptical of the idea that financial incentives and creative integrity could be perfectly reconciled, and Banned in China was the most direct and most globally significant expression of that skepticism. The Chinese market was simply the largest and most powerful version of a pressure that had always existed, the pressure to produce content that did not alienate the people with the money to consume it. When the people with the money were also the people whose government had specific ideological requirements, the financial pressure and the censorship pressure became the same pressure, and the creative choices made under that combined pressure were no longer simply commercial decisions. They were political ones, made by institutions that preferred not to think of themselves as political actors. The German DJ Zed posted on social media that he had been permanently banned from China for liking a South Park tweet about the episode, an incident that illustrated how far the pressure extended, from major studios to individual artists with no direct financial relationship to the Chinese market at all. The ban was presumably automated or near automated, a keyword search identifying his name in connection with prohibited content and removing his access as a consequence. The efficiency of the system was itself part of the show's point, the way a government with sufficient technological infrastructure and sufficient political will could make the cost of association with certain ideas immediate and concrete even for people who had no relationship to the original content. The chilling effect radiated outward from the episode in real time, Wang and Yu Men demonstrating to anyone watching that the Chinese censorship system operated through exactly the broad and indiscriminate suppression that the episode was describing. South Park never appeared on Chinese streaming platforms again. Parker and Stone made no subsequent effort to repair the relationship, issued no genuine apology, took no steps to have the show reinstated. The mock apology was the only statement they made, and its tone made clear that the loss of the Chinese market was a cost they had calculated and accepted before the episode aired. The show's 5-year deal with Paramount, signed in 2019 and worth approximately $900 million, did not include any provision for Chinese distribution, a detail that suggested the creators had made their peace with the geography of the show's reach before Banned in China ever broadcast. What the episode permanently added to the show's political argument is the recognition that the most powerful censors in the 21st century are not governments issuing prohibitions, but markets issuing incentives, and that the creative communities which depend on those markets for their financial survival are capable of performing censorship on those markets' behalf with a thoroughness and an efficiency that no government could achieve through direct compulsion alone. The smug cloud over San Francisco was visible and measurable and funny. The adjustment of Hollywood scripts to satisfy Chinese censors was invisible, distributed across thousands of individual creative decisions made in writers' rooms and studio notes and production meetings, and it was not funny at all. It was the extremism of economic scale, the power of a market large enough to shape the culture of a country that believed itself to be free, operating through the willing cooperation of the institutions that culture had built. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Banned in China showed that the most powerful censorship in the modern world requires no censor, only a market large enough to make silence the rational choice. Next, in the final section, all of these threads come together in the show's most recent and most personal confrontation with political extremism. The moment when the formula that had held for nearly 3 decades finally broke under the weight of what was happening in the country it had been built to observe. Section 10. When the middle stopped holding. For nearly 3 decades, South Park maintained a position that was genuinely unusual in American popular culture. A program of enormous reach and enormous irreverence that refused to be claimed by either side of the political divide, that mocked the left as readily as the right, that treated the extremist on each side as the mirror image of the extremist on the other, and that placed its 4 children in the middle as the only reliable compass the town possessed. The formula was the show's identity. It was also, as the preceding sections have documented, a position that came under increasing strain as the years accumulated and the political landscape around it shifted in ways the formula had not been designed to accommodate. The Man-Bear-Pig correction acknowledged that the formula could fail when the evidence was asymmetric. The Cartoon War's aftermath acknowledged that the formula could be overridden by violence. Banned in China acknowledged that economic power could silence the formula entirely. And then, beginning in 2025, the show did something that none of its previous adjustments had fully prepared the audience for. It abandoned the formula. The abandonment was not announced as such. Parker and Stone did not hold a press conference and declare that the both sides' position was retired. What they did was make a season, the 27th, that was directed almost entirely at one target, and then make another season, the 28th, that continued in the same direction, and then explain, in interviews, that they did not believe they had changed their position, but that the political environment had changed around them so thoroughly that responding to it with their usual symmetry would itself have been a kind of dishonesty. The show had always chased the taboo, Stone had said. Wherever the thing no one would say was located, that was where they wanted to be. In 2025, the thing no one in American entertainment would say, at least without considerable personal and institutional risk, was a sustained and direct critique of the sitting president and his administration. So that was where they went. The season 27 premiere, titled Sermon on the Mount, aired on the 23rd of July 2025. It was the first traditional episode the show had produced in more than 2 years, following a period of specials and limited releases that had kept the show visible, but had not attempted the kind of weekly political commentary the program had built its reputation on. The episode opened with Cartman furious that NPR had been canceled, grieving the death of what he described as the best comedy about the miseries of the progressive world, a joke that established immediately that the show had not abandoned its willingness to mock the left. The self-aware gesture toward the woke cultural exhaustion that the previous seasons had documented was the show reminding its audience that it had not switched teams, and then the episode turned its full attention to Donald Trump. The depictions were not subtle. Trump was shown as Satan's lover, a relationship played across both seasons with a strange tonal complexity that mixed grotesque comedy with something that occasionally resembled genuine political alarm. Vice President J.D. Vance appeared as a diminutive manservant. Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem was depicted killing puppies and directing immigration enforcement with sadistic enthusiasm, a reference to a passage in her published memoir describing how she had shot a misbehaving dog on her farm. The show sued the town of South Park on Trump's behalf. Jesus returned to the school, placed there by a government promoting Christianity in public education, and wandered the halls trying to figure out where he fit in the landscape of institutional religion that had claimed him. The episode was, as one review described it, the most sustained and direct attack on a sitting American president the show had ever mounted, harder than anything it had done to George W. Bush or Barack Obama or any previous occupant of the office. The White House responded within days. An official spokesperson issued a statement describing South Park as a show that had not been relevant for over 20 years, that was hanging on by a thread, and that was producing uninspired ideas in a desperate attempt for attention. The statement was itself a piece of evidence for the show's argument, a government spokesperson devoting official time and resources to attacking a cartoon for mocking the president, which is behavior the show had spent nearly 3 decades pointing at as a symptom of political extremism rather than a quality of legitimate governance. The White House statement was better satire of the administration than anything the show could have invented, and the show's creators did not need to respond to it because it had done their work for them. The ratings the new seasons generated were the clearest possible refutation of the White House's relevance claim. The season 27 premiere drew nearly 6 million cross-platform viewers, the show's biggest linear premiere rating since 1999, the year of the film. The second episode grew further to 6.2 million viewers. Parker and Stone had signed a 5-year deal with Paramount in 2025, worth approximately $1.5 billion, guaranteeing 50 new episodes, and the ratings suggested the deal was justified by the audience's hunger for exactly what the show was now providing. The program that the White House had dismissed as irrelevant was more watched than it had been in a quarter century. Parker and Stone explained their position in an interview with the New York Times, published during the season's run. They insisted they had not gotten more political. What had happened, Parker said, was that politics had become pop culture, that the distinction between the two had collapsed to the point where it was impossible to make a show about contemporary American life without making a show about the current administration, because the administration was present in every aspect of contemporary American life in a way that previous administrations had not been. Whether you agreed with the show's politics or not, the description of the environment was accurate. The Trump administration's second term had generated a volume and intensity of political news that saturated every corner of public life, from late-night television to sports to music to the conversations that happened at dinner tables and school pickup lines. The formula that placed the children in the middle while the extremists ranted on each side depended on the extremists staying in their designated corners. By 2025, one of the extremists had occupied the center. Stone added that they were still down the middle guy, that any extremist of any kind was still their target, that they had spent years mocking the woke movement and would continue mocking whatever they found most ridiculous. The season 27 Halloween episode had Stan deliver a speech about how South Park had gotten too political and how everyone knew the show sucked now, a piece of self-aware meta-commentary that acknowledged the criticism from the show's own audience, while also gently refusing to accept it. The show was aware it had shifted. It was not apologizing for the shift. The self-awareness was the show's way of marking the shift as a deliberate choice, rather than an unexamined drift. What the seasons 27 and 28 represent in the show's long argument about political extremism is the point at which the argument became personal. South Park had spent nearly 3 decades observing extremism from a position of deliberate detachment, placing itself above the fray, refusing to be recruited by either side, maintaining the posture of the child who can see what the adults cannot because the child has not yet signed up for a team. That posture was always partly a performance, as the man-bear-pig correction and the subtle asymmetries of the show's target selection had always suggested, but it was also a genuine philosophical position, held with real conviction, that the spectacle of political extremism was most usefully satirized from outside rather than from within, that the satirist who joined a team became a propagandist and lost the perspective that made satire worth reading. The decision to target one administration so directly and so persistently was a departure from that position, and the show knew it and made the departure anyway. The reasoning Parker and Stone offered, that the taboo had shifted and they were following the taboo, is consistent with the show's founding instinct and also somewhat convenient as a justification for what was, at some level, a choice about what to say and what not to say, the same choice every satirist makes in every season. But the reasoning points at something real. The act of mocking the current administration in the climate of 2025, when other comedy programs had been canceled or had pulled punches in response to real or perceived pressure from the government, carried a quality of risk that the show's usual both sides posture would not have carried. Going after the powerful thing that was actively hostile to criticism of itself was, in that specific environment, the thing that required courage. That is where the show went. The formula that had defined South Park's political identity for nearly 3 decades was not wrong for the years it served. The symmetry it insisted on captured something true about the period it was describing, the long stretch of American political life in which the loudest voices on both sides were producing roughly equivalent varieties of destructive certainty, when the smug environmentalist and the climate denier and the culture warrior and the morality enforcer were all operating within a range of dysfunction that the children in the middle could survey from a single vantage point and find equally absurd. The formula was honest for those years. The adjustment was honest for these years. The consistency is not in the target, but in the underlying instinct, which has always been to go where the danger is, to say the thing that the institutions around the show have decided is too risky to say, to let the reaction to the saying serve as evidence that the saying was necessary. The White House called them irrelevant. The ratings said otherwise. Paramount paid $1.5 billion for the right to keep them making episodes. The formula had evolved, as honest formulas eventually must, in response to a world that had evolved past the conditions that made the original formula sufficient. The children of South Park are still in the middle. little, still watching the adults lose their minds, still the closest thing to a reliable compass the town possesses. The adults around them are still the problem. What has changed is which adult, in which moment, is most thoroughly and most dangerously out of control. South Park began in 1997 with a group of children watching their parents wage war on a cartoon, and it built from that first image an argument that has run for nearly 3 decades about who the grown-ups really are in any given room, and whether the people claiming that title have actually earned it. The extremism it has documented across those decades has taken every shape available to it: religious and political and economic and cultural, enforced from the left and from the right and from foreign governments and from market forces and from the very networks the show has depended on for its survival. The children have watched all of it. They have been unable to stop most of it. They have, in the most important sense, kept their footing while the adults around them lost theirs. And the keeping of footing, the refusal to be swept into the current that everyone else is moving with, is the show's deepest and most consistent argument about what political sanity looks like. It does not look like agreement. It does not look like neutrality. It looks like a 10-year-old standing in the middle of a town that has lost its mind and saying, as clearly and as simply as possible, that things have gone too far. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.